So today we are joined by UCLA's own Chris Kelty and Jessica Lynch. Chris is a professor in the Institute for Society and Genetics. He also has an appointment in the Department of Information Studies and the Department of Anthropology. Jessica is an associate professor in the Institute for Society and Genetics and also has an appointment here in the Department of Anthropology. And I think it's also nice to note the fact that their appointments in the Department of Anthropology are in cultural, social cultural anthropology, as well as biological anthropology. So their work today will be investigating a multi-species study of relationships between humans and our feline friends. And it's a great area to show that there's a great deal of interest in these kinds of multi-species topics. And it's an area to foster interdisciplinary research in the social and biological sciences. So I'm really excited to hear about their work today. Their paper is unpublished, but they're doing us a favor by joining us today and talking about their work. Their title is called Pouncing on Opportunities, Domestic Feral Cat Biology and Global Human-Mediated Cat Niche Expansion. So thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today. Welcome to Beck.
Thanks very much, Brian. Appreciate the opportunity to do this. Jessica and I are really pleased to be able to present this in the Beck series, get some feedback from you for a paper that we're hoping to submit very soon. And she and I are going to do a little bit of a handoff back and forth. I'll introduce us and take us through the beginnings of the talk, and then we'll go back and forth a little bit, hopefully technically, and in terms of following the argument, it won't be too difficult. I think we have it all organized. It's a great opportunity for us to get feedback on this project, which really is, as Brian said, an attempt for the two of us to find innovative ways to think across cultural and biological anthropology. And there's some interesting stories to how we came to that project. And so I'll just start with that, I think. And let me share the screen here. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see that. So I will start there. It's I usually start these with a land acknowledgement. Although for me, in this particular moment, I'm coming to you from Germany, so I'm not really quite clear on what the proper land acknowledgement is there. Maybe it's the Holy Roman Emperor, but maybe when Jessica starts, we can acknowledge that at least many of you are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva tribes. Okay. So a bit of an overview from where we're coming from. This project came out of a collaboration between Jessica and I, and I'm actually really grateful to Jessica for drawing me into this, because at some point she decided she wanted to do a project on mammals in Los Angeles, and wrote some grants to do that, and came up with some ideas about thinking about what kinds of mammals inhabit Los Angeles, and drew me into it at one point and said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Sure, I'll that sounds like fun." And it's been a real sort of career shift for me, and I've opened up a whole new project for me, and so I'm really grateful to Jessica for drawing me into that. The original project that started this off was what's called the LA Urban Mammals Project, that Jessica was the PI for, along with myself, Tony Frischia in IBP, Jamie Lloyd-Smith, and Katie Prager and Sarah Hellman in EEB, and lots of undergraduates from EEB and HBS, that really was looking at urban mammals, population genetics, disease transmission, and some cultural aspects of mammal control. And LA urban mammals include quite a range. Of course, we have famous mountain lions, coyotes, but also raccoons, skunks, possums, and squirrels, and a few others that are less common. And that project went on for a couple of years. Out of that project, then there was also something that I started called the Labyrinth Project, which included graduate students from IOES, anthropology, a couple of anthropology grads from cultural that you see listed there, environmental health studies, and communications and information studies. And that project has been ongoing for a while. And actually, funnily enough, it was in that project that Jessica and I decided that she should really take seriously this interest in feral cats. And so she took the initiative to start this project, which I think for the two of us came at the intersection of two kinds of approaches that we bring to this. So one is basically sort of the tradition of ethnoprimatology that Jessica's an expert in, and the other is what is now in cultural anthropology going by the label of multi-species ethnography, which I think actually owes a lot to ethnoprimatology as its origin point, to be honest. But the two of them sort of come together, and much of what we do in the Institute for Society and Genetics is really try and sort of smash these disciplines together and see what comes out. And so here, trying to figure out what are the connections and disconnections between ethnoprimatology and multi-species ethnography. How can you use ethnographic observations, interviews, the methods of hermeneutic and cultural anthropology alongside those of biological anthropology, evolutionary theory, behavioral ecology, and so forth. And there are some interesting ways in which what we're doing here is modeling this on ethnoprimatology, and this has been something that has shown up in the literature a little bit. There are examples of people thinking about, for instance, ethno-elephantology or ethno-canidology. And so we're sort of pushing this in the direction of ethno-felidology here, really to take seriously the reality of the interface between humans and cats, and to study their histories, ecologies, lives, and livelihoods. Jessica's taken this quote, which is from Aaron Riley article about ethnoprimatology, and replaced it with ethnofelidology here. So that's our pitch here for that. Now, the project, in a way, especially under the auspices of the Labyrinth project that I sort of continued from the Urban Mammals project, happened mostly in the summer of 2019, and Jessica especially led this research into the feral cat and TNR controversy in Los Angeles, which is a really amazing, complex, bizarre, somewhat surprising controversy with a lot of different elements in it. And this involved doing some interviews with people, doing some field work. You can see Jessica there on the middle, looking in at one of the places that we visited, which was one of these spay and neuter clinics where they spay and neuter between 60 and 120 cats a day. You can see them over here on the right-hand side, not euthanized, anesthetized, and getting ready for spay and neuter and vaccination. And the TNR controversy in Los Angeles, just to give you a sort of very brief overview, and I can say more at the end if people have questions about this, has been going on for over a decade now. One of the key elements of it is the no-kill movement, the idea that if possible, it would be nice not to kill any of the animals in shelters, dogs or cats. And that movement has been very successful. It's reached its 90% rate of adoptions and no-kill in 2020. And part of the no-kill project has been to engage in what's known as trap, neuter, and release for cats that live on the landscape, basically homeless cats, community cats, feral cats, unowned cats, and we'll go through some of that later. Trap, neuter, return, of course, means that what people do, volunteers for the most part, trap cats, bring them to these clinics where they're spayed or neutered, and then actually return them to the environment. Now, of course, the reason that this is controversial is that cats are a significant impact on the environment. Cats hunt and kill a huge number of birds and rodents. The estimates are between, and they're very broad estimates, 1.3 to 4 billion birds and 6.3 to 22 billion mammals globally annually. And in some places, cats have even been declared an invasive species, as in Australia, New Zealand, and a lot of islands because of the impact that they have on this environment. So this controversy then led to a lot of disputes within the city about what animal services in the city, what these private organizations, what environmental groups should be doing with this problem, which includes a extensive environmental impact review and a lot of very intense politics. One clear lesson I took from this is never pick a fight with cat lovers, right? It's just not a winning strategy for your future. But it really is this sort of intense, emotionally intense and politically intense controversy. Now, out of that, we, I think, therefore, came out with some questions. And at this point, you might think, okay, why do TNR? Well, for a lot of the people involved, the process is seen as a solution to the overpopulation of cats. And the overpopulation of cats, according to TNR, can be controlled through spay and neuter, so that eventually the populations will decrease, either stabilize or decrease. That's the argument of the TNR advocates. There's plenty of evidence suggesting that this actually doesn't happen, but that's also part of the controversy, and it's an interesting part of that controversy. So cats are, under threat here in some ways because they're being spayed and neutered and widely across the city, but they're also under threat as an invasive species in places like Australia and New Zealand. And you might, then ask the point whether or not this is a dangerous moment for cats, right? Are cats threatened? Is this the end for cats? Because, humans have finally realized that they need to control cats and take care of them. And I think that's the sort of setup for the rest of this talk, which is that Jessica and I think are pretty sure that that's not actually going to be a problem. Cats are going to be just fine. And actually what is interesting about cats is the nature of their success as a companion species with humans. And so I think I'll hand it over to Jessica at this point and let her tell you what the rest of the paper is going to be about. Hopefully that introduction gives you some sense of where we're coming from.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me and Chris to give this talk. So I'm basically going to start by summarizing the frame of the paper that we're going to present today. So as Chris said, it started with this ethnography that was based in Los Angeles and focused on trap, neuter, return and those controversies. But that's probably another paper or a couple papers in themselves about Los Angeles. And it's really thinking about cats and humans and their interactions and collaborations with each other that has led us in this direction of the paper we're gonna talk about with you today. And so, like Chris mentioned, we used an ethnoprimatology type of frame in order to start thinking about cat-human relations in that framework. And I think that we do owe part of what we're doing also to multi-species ethnography, but we're trying to shift the frame to a more cat-centric perspective instead of a kind of, I think that multi-species ethnography does try to move from a fully human-centric perspective, but we're trying to push it further into thinking about the other animals as the key or the most important part. And so when we did that, when we started pushing things more towards thinking about the cat as the center, then we moved into thinking about trying to think about the history of cats and humans interactions together in terms of this frame of the cat niche and niche expansion over time. And how we're thinking about this and how we're going to present it is that it's not an all or nothing change, but how different kinds of circumstances that cats found themselves in led to different types of expansion of their niche to end up with what we have today, which is this really wide cat niche and cats kind of dominating a lot of the planet. And so we start off with this divergence of Felis libica and Felis catus, and I'll show you maps so we can see that moment and think about that, which was only the last 10,000 years that we have this cat-human collaboration. So it's a relatively short time if we're thinking about evolutionary history, at least biological evolution. And so we'll walk you through some of these examples that we're thinking about in terms of niche expansion, such as activity, cycle, circadian rhythm, and diet breadth. And we'll also talk about the sterile cat niche and go back to thinking about TNR and kind of how that started us thinking about all these different changes that are happening to cats and how cats adapt to those new situations. And so I think one thing that's not within the scope of the paper as we have it written so far, but that I think the Beck opportunity to talk with all of you about this paper and these ideas could lead to either additions in the paper or to further collaborations or further research. Really thinking about modeling things from an evolutionary perspective, and so I'm gonna like pepper the talk with some questions, just thinking about from what we figured out so far, like how can we extend this and think about evolutionary perspectives on these different aspects of cat niche expansion. And then we're really looking forward to the Q&A and talking with you at the end. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of kind of what I mean by moving toward a more cat-centric view, just in terms of our own research and the way that we have been talking about things over time, I think it has been a really productive collaboration with Chris. And we've seen, like, as we explore these different disciplinary frames and as we talk to each other, like what started out to be the center of the project and how it changes to other things with this move towards cat-centrism. So just for example, we started off interested in human hoarding and gathering of cats, either within captive indoor structures or in the community cat situation. And now we shift to think about cat flexibility and social organization and how cats can make those changes, or what happens when cats make those changes. We also started trying to understand why humans would lavish so much care on cats in particular, and wondering about the human predilection for cat cuteness. But then we kind of shifted again the frame to thinking about evolutionary adaptations to hunting for small prey and how that leads to what for humans is cuteness, and it makes cats attractive. And then rather than the focus on TNR and human care, here we think about how cats themselves capitalize on human subsidies and expand their niche in different ways under different human cultural circumstances. Next slide. So I want to just go through framing with some of the terms that we were thinking about as we're working on this project. And one is this kind of central idea of niche, which Wines defines as the combination of abiotic and biotic conditions where a species can persist. And Hutchinson calls it a multidimensional hypervolume defined by a set of independent variables that represent biologically relevant axes. And we're using this idea of the multidimensional hypervolume and specifying different particular variables of interest as these biological axes to think about over time the cumulative effect of different circumstances that led to different ones of these variables expanding. And so we'll kind of walk through that with you. But another way, just thinking about these terms we're talking about, this filled hypervolume represents intra or infra-specific trait variability and the realized niche of the species. And you can go to the next slide. And so when we think about this realized niche of the species of the domestic cat, then these are the niche dimensions that we're talking about that could expand over time. And they're a little bit in the order of kind of how we're thinking about how this happened over time as well as historically. But so one key feature that seems to be kind of the crux of the change that led to the other possibilities is the developmental plasticity for a shift toward docility. And cats are, I think, a key component of what cats are is that they have this flexibility to move back and forth between docile and wild or feral based on a particular individual's development and exposure. But then we could think about things like geography or habitat and how human collaboration in moving across continents with ships or across other barriers has led to this wide expansion in geography and habitat use. And then other things like population dynamics, lifespan and reproductive capacity. When you have them move toward indoor care for pets, you have a real change in these life history parameters. And that kind of goes along with changes with sleeping sites or living quarters. And then I'll also focus on a particular example comparing changes in circadian rhythm and also ecological role and diet as a result of living with humans. And we'll also give other examples of niche dimensions of social organization and morphology. Next slide. So niche construction is another term that's used when a species transforms an environment enough to give itself a reproductive or survival advantage, and then this ability may become a heritable capacity. But in this case, however, from our perspective, human cultural change is allowing for humans to construct new niche spaces, mostly for themselves, but also sometimes specifically and pretty impressively for cats. And cats, either way, whether it's incidental, a byproduct of human behavior, or specifically directed at cats, cats are taking advantage and utilizing these new spaces. Next slide. And so another way that this has been discussed, both about cats and in general about domesticated animals or other animals that humans have collaborations with, is through these kind of terms like symbiosis, mutualism, and so on. And the idea there is that depending on what kind of relationship the human has with the animal, then you may have a different expectation of the evolutionary dynamics and outcome. But we also argue that depending on which niche variable that you're thinking about, which part of the niche space, you could see many or all of these different things acting in different ways in terms of the cat-human relationship. Next slide. And so then another term, and a term that we're using here, is niche expansion. And so this one's interesting in that it's often used in biology in a non-human mediated context, with the expectation that if individuals are more variable within populations, then the species will have a wider overall niche. So here we are considering human-mediated cat niche expansion, as well as cat niche space saturation. And just thinking about this, I'm just going to read you a little bit from the paper. With human-assisted geographic expansion, cats can fill the same niches over a wider distribution, and through access to human resources, such as shelter, food, and care, cats can additionally expand the width of their niche in multiple dimensions in a given location. And they can occupy the original or wild niche as space, as well as the new human-facilitated space within the niche simultaneously in the same location. And so this niche saturation across the old and new niche space by different populations of cats or different individuals within a cat population, spanning the spectrum of old and new possibilities for lifestyles, allows for overall higher population density and environmental and ecological impact. Next slide. So now I wanted to kind of go back to the beginning of the story, or actually way before the human part of the story, to just point out. So one of the questions we kind of were talking about at the beginning was this question of cuteness, the cuteness of cats and how that factors in. And one point to recognize is that cats have been cute far before humans even existed. And so that's something that's coming much later into the game as humans' recognition of those features as cute. And so cats have evolved from a large-bodied ancestor to this smaller-bodied group, the Felis species. So all of the species pictured here are within the Felis genus, and they're all small-bodied cats that have hypercarnivore specialization in hunting nocturnal rodent prey. And so the features that you see that are cat features such as large forward-facing eyes, wide, large ears, soft footsteps, thick fur. All of these things are adaptations to hunting nocturnal prey. And Chris, did you want to jump in with that quote?
Oh yeah, I added this because the more work we do on this, the more I discover people who have written something about cats, and none other than the great 20th century novelist William S. Burroughs was a cat fan, and I just think it's interesting to note that he's ruminating on cats and whether and sort of makes our point for us, and that there must have been a split at some point in history, he says, between the cats who accepted domestication and those who did not. And that's one of the things we're struggling with here, right? Is sort of among these different species, which ones accepted domestication and which ones did not.
And so just to orient towards the species I have on this slide here, the African wildcat Felis libica is the one that is believed to have been based on genomic data, is the one that's believed to be the ancestor of Felis catus, the modern domestic cat. And very closely related to that is the European wildcat, and then sometimes included in the same species as well as the Chinese mountain cat, which has a much smaller distribution. I'm going to show the distributions in a minute. And then the three on the bottom are also in the Felis genus, with the sand cat being the sister species to, if you did lump all those ones on top as one species, the sand cat is the most closely related species to them. But there's also evidence for hybridization between the black-footed cat and the African wildcat as well. Okay, next slide. So another thing that we, first we're thinking about was the small location for the origin of Felis catus, the modern domestic cat, as being within the Fertile Crescent, and the highly specific conditions that domestication event happened under. But when we started to think about cats and cat capacities, and we looked at this distribution of where wild cats live, and this is a lumping of Felis libica and Felis sylvestris together, which is how they were classified up until 2015 here. Then one of the things that you can see about cats is that they already had an extremely wide distribution and were highly successful. And so probably the things, inhibiting their further spread are things like oceans and big mountains, but otherwise they were able to spread quite widely. So next slide. And so here is the area, the Fertile Crescent area is where it's believed that the domestic cat was domesticated, and Chris will talk a little bit more about how that happened, but at about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And interestingly, from this map, you can see it's kind of at the center of the distribution of wild cats. Although on the next slide, a new classification of cats in the genus Felis now changes things to say that Felis libica on the right, it just includes the African and Asian wildcats, and a separate species, Felis sylvestris, is the European wildcat. Although in that case as well, if you again, next slide, if you look at that Fertile Crescent region, it's at this crossroads of all these different species or subspecies. So it's still kind of in the heart of this overall distribution. And in fact, the domestic cat can and does hybridize with all of these different forms that are pictured here. So across all of that range, they are hybridizing with wild cats. And as this, one thing that we found as we were trying to do research on domestic cats is you typically get this kind of, this is exactly what's in this paper. They have maps of distribution that try to be quite specific for the other species, but for Felis catus, no map, and it just says worldwide distribution except Antarctica. So next slide. And And so one thing I wanted to point to was why there was this change in species status and what's going on with introgression. And so just to read these highlighted sections, this is from the IUCN that made the cat specialist group that made this change. These taxonomic niceties are of the highest operational importance because the current legislation intended to protect the wildcat is framed in terms that can be effective only if the wildcat is recognized as a separate species. And it says that because in the IUCN red listing, the threat of hybridization from invasive species can be counted as something that is an imminent threat for extinction, right? And so, but you have to be two separate species in order to be facing that threat. And so this is a practical reason to separate Felis catus from these other species, even though it's actually, when you look at the genome, it's almost this, it's basically the same thing. And it's a very recent divergence. And so, and below here also, there are probably very few, if any, wildcat populations which have little history of hybridization with domestic cats. And this is actually better known for the wildcats across many European countries, but they're the less closely related to the domestic cats, whereas the Asian and African wildcats are even more similar. And it's likely that that same kind of hybridization is happening. Next slide. So then I'm also just going to show a few slides looking at distribution of these different species of cat. And so one of these ideas of niche expansion is that expansion from right, you have the wide distribution of Felis libica, but then you have the small point of origin in the Fertile Crescent, which is thought to have had multiple domestication events. But then from there, from the Fertile Crescent, you have this spread of Felis catus across the world to this distribution you see here. And so this is being a little more specific, at least, than worldwide distribution. This comes from iNaturalist, and this is observations from citizen scientists all around the world that can enter observations for different species, including these different kinds of cats. So here you can see there are 16,000 observations for domestic cats on iNaturalist. And also, just for context, the world's population of domestic cats is estimated at about 600 million. Which makes it one of the most populous mammal species. Obviously, there are a lot of biases that would be inherent with iNaturalist data, but just for comparison with the same data set category of iNaturalist, if we go to the next slide, here you can see for Felis libica imposed on the expected distribution. And then the observations here, there are 347 observations for Felis libica across Africa and Asia, and then 282 for Felis silvestris across Europe. And when you look at these actual, so with iNaturalist, they actually have to provide a picture as an evidence of having seen the right species. And most of these, especially for the European ones, they're from camera trap and nocturnal pictures, or they're very far away, or they're from roadkill. And so suggesting it's still really pretty hard to see these species for humans. And this points to that real difference between the shift in being able to be awake and active anytime during night and day, and the degree of tameness, even for feral domestic cats, is really different, it seems, than for wild cats. Next slide. So one thing I didn't mention, but if you go back to the, if you go back to the wildcat, the next one before that, the domestic cat. So again, that idea of worldwide isn't really that accurate, and you can see that cats don't do well in the northern climes, and even some of those places they are anthro-dependent. They wouldn't be able to survive there if they didn't have humans and be living in homes. And you can also see that rainforests aren't good habitats, desert not so much. Mountains probably for the cold aspect for one thing as well. So they're not evenly distributed. They have a specific distribution, although part of that may be the skew with just who's using iNaturalist as well. Okay, and so just going forward. Then I wanted to say that even though some habitats like rainforests, they're much less common in, they actually are there. And as the habitats are transforming, they may be having more impact. So this is just, I had to get a monkey into the talk somehow. So this is, and they're actually cuter than cats, by the way, you can see there. This species, Miko rondoni, who if you go to the next slide, you can see has a very small distribution within the Amazon. This was just a report of 3 cats that were trying to predate this group of monkeys and did catch this infant, and then a human came in and snatched the infant out and saved the monkeys. So they are having impact in even these habitats we don't think about them as doing that great in. Okay, next slide. And so just to throw in here some thoughts of evolutionary perspectives, just this question, this kind of conundrum of wild cats and domestic cats, and in those same broad areas in Europe, Asia, and Africa, wild cats are declining, and they're in the thousands. Their populations are in the thousands in many countries, whereas you have these huge numbers for domestic cats. Why is there this discrepancy, and how does that relate to the hybridization or integration that's happening? And why is this happening despite the fact that, as Montague et al. Said, there's that contemporary domestic cats lack clear genomic evidence for behavioral and morphological differences from wild cats, except for tameness. So how can they be so similar and yet having these massively different fates, even though they're interacting with each other at the same time? And I think another call is that there's really much less information, at least that we've found so far, available for what's going on with African wildcats compared to European wildcats. So that would be another direction to look into. Next slide.
So this long evolutionary history then is something that gave us a way to think about the background sort of capacities of the cat as it enters into this collaboration with humans in the course of human history. And one of the things that we wanted to think about then, and we've been sort of trying to research by reading the extant literature on this and thinking about what we do know about the domestic cat, are the different places where cat-human collaborations have had particular kinds of liftoff. And I think an important thing to recognize here is that we're working with a kind of transformed idea of domestication, which I think is coming both from literature and archaeology these days, but also a little bit from cultural anthropologists who are reading that literature and archaeology, and thinking about domestication not as a single event, not as a invention, not as an intentional act on the part of humans, the sort of classic V. Gordon Child story of man making himself, but rather as this ongoing process that needs to be specified in new ways in terms of different forms of collaborations between animals. And so hopefully what we have to say about cats here is useful for thinking a little bit about other kinds of creatures that we conventionally think of as being domesticated, like cattle or chickens or dogs. But cats are really actually pretty interesting and special here because they do maintain this capacity to go back and forth between being feral and wild. And pretty much everything you read on cats, at some point someone will point out that they're not really domesticated. They're not directed to a task in this classic sense of domestication. Even their most vaunted capacity in this respect, which is pest control, most people will be like, yeah, they're good, but they're not as good as dogs would be, or muskrats or ferrets or snakes, right, which can be trained to do actual pest control. Cats sort of do it on their own time, and then you know, if you're lucky, they've got a good employee, and so they do maintain this capacity to go back and forth. So we thought about several of these examples based on some of this literature in domestication, and thinking about what happens after this moment in the Neolithic period when it's clear that there are sort of multiple events of cats coming into collaboration with humans. And I particularly like this phrase from James Scott, where he's writing in his book Against the Grain, the late neoliberal multi-species resettlement camp, just this sense that with the rise of cities in the Neolithic, in the Fertile Crescent, in the Neolithic period, late Neolithic period, you have this sort of multi-species resettlement. You have grain being stored, you have rodents coming in, you have cats. And so, the sort of general sort of theory of why these different creatures might associate with each other in a multi-species environment makes a certain amount of sense. And then you have the opportunities for some of those animals to develop adaptations in an evolutionary sense, or just as populations to be more successful in particular places than in other places in this collaboration with humans. And so I think, part of what we're pointing to here is that while terms like symbiosis or mutualism or commensalism might actually describe that relationship, they don't describe it the same with respect to every dimension of what cats can or do or are capable of. And was one of the reasons why we want to look at this sort of multidimensional niche space and think, okay, where are the expansions happening exactly? And it's a way of kind of breaking apart domestication and saying, okay, what are all these different expansions doing? Gregor Larson and Melinda Zader are two people whose work have been very influential for us in thinking about this. And one of the ways in which it's modeled these days is thinking about domestication as having different pathways, like a commensal pathway, a prey pathway, or the classic, the original theorization of a directed pathway. And so cats very much fit into this commensal pathway as animals that happen to be associated with humans and therefore benefiting from that. Now, just to go back here, we thought about many of these different moments. So this Neolithic development, there's a kind of really interesting story of the cat's historic importance in Egypt especially, but also in Greece and Rome. It's a very interesting story, but we can't tell you the whole story here, sadly. We had to cut it out of the paper. The subsequent, also in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, demonization of cats, the association of cats with witches and with unsanctioned forms of femininity, for instance, is another sort of very important part in the history of the cat as a collaborator with humans. But there are a couple that I just wanted to point out here that are really important obviously to the success of the cat today, and those are colonization and what we're calling pet industrialism, right? So cats were, from the beginning, seafarers along with Western European colonists. And one of the simple ways in which this is attested is the quote down here on the bottom, which is actually from the 1655 Treatise on Maritime Law, in which you see that if you have a damaged goods on your ship from rats, you're responsible as the captain, unless you had a cat on board, in which case you're absolved from your responsibility for the damage to the goods. And so, even within the annals of maritime law, cats are there as a kind of co-collaborator in the colonization of the planet. And of course, the stories of cats being on ships also includes the stories, although less commonly told, of cats missing the boat, as it were. And so, the reason cats are in New Zealand and in Australia and on islands all over the world is in part because they decamped and didn't get back on the boat. And then there are also stories of colonization where cats are actually active partners, barn cats, agricultural cats, worker cats, that are brought in as part of the sort of settler societies that spread during colonization. And then a second really important moment in the success of the cat is obviously the rise of pet keeping, which, although there are pets going back, as long as, and in all kinds of different and interesting ways, as long as human history, really pet keeping as at the scale that we know it today is only about 100, 150 years old. And it starts in part alongside the industrialization of livestock as well, because if you're going to keep cats in cities with humans, you have to feed cats and humans as well. So there's a kind of paralleling of the demographic transition of humans with the rise of pet keeping. But it was also a project of moral improvement, pet keeping, at least in certain aspects of white European culture in the 19th and 20th century, that one could become a certain kind of better human, a more civilized human, by being a pet owner. And this is an interesting story of pet keeping as a moral project of human improvement, not just a question of whether the cats are succeeding. And so there's a kind of back and forth there about what cats are doing for humans as well as what humans are doing for cats. Cat populations today, as we found out in looking at the TNR controversy in Los Angeles, are all over the place in terms of how they associate with each other, what kinds of relations they have, how they live, etc. Just the very list of names that are used to refer to cats in the city: tame, wild, stray, owned, house, shelter, homeless, feral, domestic, adopted, fostered, working, barn, outdoor, indoor, community, colony, and then pink cats, which is what I'll have to explain that later. They're not actually pink, but lots of different terms for cats. And you can see here just some images, right, of cats living in a colony, cats out at night, cats working in barns, cats living in cities. If you've ever been to Istanbul, you've seen cats all over the streets, or Tel Aviv, many other parts of the Middle East where cats are thriving in the city, but not kept as pets. And so one of the things we did was to model this a little bit in terms of how to understand the different ways in which cats occupy a city, for instance, and for that matter, an urban or a rural place as well. But we're primarily focused on cities here. Just thinking about what it means for a cat to be owned or unowned, for instance, is different than understanding what it means for a cat to be roaming, or an indoor-outdoor cat. Some people keep their cats indoors entirely. Some people keep their cats indoors, but with a little catio built onto their house so that their cat can go outdoors. Some people, let their cats roam to the point where the cat doesn't come home, and then the cat can become a street cat. Cats move back and forth between being solitary and being part of colonies. And then, of course, the role of the government and animal shelters, animal services in the city moves cats as well, between shelters and colonies, between shelters and homes through adoption or through picking up cats. And so cats move all over the place. These populations are in this sort of constant movement. And this is, of course, of moment for the sort of political context of thinking about dealing with cats in a city. But I think it also is a really good demonstration of their ability to move back and forth between a docile or feral set of capacities, right? They have a certain kind of freedom that we don't normally associate with organisms. We think of them as having fixed habitats, right? And this is a really good example of how many different kinds of choices cats actually have in this world. So that's just a way of setting up something which I think Jessica will talk a little bit more in detail here, is how to think about how niche saturation or niche expansion is happening as a result of these different capacities that cats have.
So this is just a first attempt, and this is a bit more impressionistic than data-driven in terms of the actual placement of the colors on the figure. But just to walk you through, it's an idea of thinking about niche expansion in 2 dimensions. So on the vertical axis, you have the wake cycle, and on the horizontal axis, you have the diet and mode of food acquisition. And so if you start out in the top left-hand corner with the nocturnal species that's focused on predating rodents, Felis libica, but then what you do with these, like by the time you move into something like Los Angeles, into the city with domestic cats, you are greatly expanding both the night-day cycles. So because cats are being basically trained by humans to eat, or made by humans to eat at a certain time of day, that's affecting their wake sleep cycle, and also being let in and out of the house at certain times of day, that's also affecting when they can go out and hunt. And so with this combination, then you can see not only are they expanding to predate things like lizards and songbirds, which are awake in the day, for example, for the indoor-outdoor cats that may just be let out in the day, so they can't predate the active rodents at night. Then they're switching to things like lizards and songbirds. But you can also see different cats, depending on their situation, scavenging in garbage and roadkill. And then also there's a whole industry that we were talking about, the pet food industry, as well as leftovers from human food, that where cats are being exposed to all these different kinds of foods in their diet that they wouldn't be able to predate on their own, right? And so with the combination of both of these, you can see this saturation across the niche space in the 2 dimensions, depending on what kind of living situation different cats find themselves in. And so the idea would be to do this kind of, we could do this kind of modeling for thinking about the different kinds of axes that we're interested in. Next slide. And I think another thing that's quite interesting in reports about, like there's two aspects. One is that cats, actually there's a few different things I wanted to say. One is that cats hunt even when they're not hungry. So this is part of their biology, that they may hunt even when they're satiated or hunt when they're not hungry. And it's thought to be a mechanism for stockpiling food when they have the opportunity. And that's something you see in them, like bringing gifts to humans and so on, of having that extra food around as well. But humans also tend to overfeed cats. And so in both of these ways, their effects of cats, both through human means and through cats' own means, is bigger than their actual hunger and satiation, because there's more cat food being given, and there's more prey being hunted even when they're not hungry. Another thing I wanted to mention that's interesting is that studies that have looked at individual cats that are owned but outdoor cats, when you look at what prey items they bring back, they're highly specialized based on the individual. So individuals are specializing on particular types of prey. And that goes back to this idea of niche saturation and individual variation. So if individuals are each focusing on their own type of prey to hunt, then you can have this wider niche space because there are more animals available, and you can get a higher population density because different animals are focusing on different species. And one question that I had in relation to that was, in cats in general, the infants are learning hunting, they're learning that developmentally from what their mother is doing. But with the disruption across multiple generations of cats learning from their mothers because of taking them away, or because of, indoor conditions where they can't observe what the mother is doing for hunting, if that limits, the limitation to social learning may affect the breadth of hunting for individuals in a way that wouldn't happen when they have the rich learning environment from their mothers. Next slide. Another aspect on the another niche dimension that we have been thinking about is morphology, and how artificial selection over the last 200 years, there's been cat fancying and this diversification of morphology of cats for pet owners and for high-end pet owners. However, this morphology has moved out onto the streets. And so one of the things that we saw, for example, in feral cat colonies is the diversity of morphotypes that are in those colonies, and that the feeders and caretakers of those cats individualize cats and know each one by a particular name, and may even have a different bowl for each cat. And that this individualization of cats by humans may affect the care and treatment of these cats. Next slide. And a question there is just whether this morphological diversity matters at all to cats themselves, or if it's only acute to humans and something ignored by the cats and cat populations. Next slide. And then one other thing that we were really interested in with trap, neuter, return is it's espoused to be a strategy to limit cat reproduction, but it may be just as much about changing cat behavior. And so in practice, TNR and spay neutering, whether it's in colonies for feral cats or indoor cats, is almost always done by gonadectomy. So that's the removal of testes and ovaries. However, if the objective is to limit cat reproduction and diminish cat colonies, for example, models have shown that THVR, trap, hysterectomized, vasectomized, return, actually stops reproductive output but keeps hormonally based behaviors intact. So you could keep the same behaviors, but stop reproduction. And models show that this THVR actually decreases colony size more effectively than TNR. So if you were just trying to decrease colony size and stop reproduction, THVR is more effective. But in fact, if you go to the next slide, it seems that what humans may really be wanting to do, both with their indoor cats and with colony cats, is to change cats into a different kind of animal through neuter and spay. So while these characteristics that I am saying that it stops are essential to being a cat, neuter and spay transform them into totally different behavior. So it can stop yowling behavior and fighting behavior. It can reduce sex drive. It makes it so they roam less far. They may stop spraying behavior. All of these are a little variable depending on the particular cat and when you do the intervention. But they've shown cats to be more affiliative, less aggressive, less territorial. And what you do see, for example, in colonies that they've studied, outdoor colonies that they've studied, if you sterilize the whole colony, then actually that's the moment that you're most likely to grow the colony, because unsterilized males come into the colony and dominate all the individuals that are in the colony. So part of the story is this selection for untrapped individuals in TNR, because they're ending up having a much higher reproductive skew than you would see in natural conditions. Yeah, so that's part of the story that we're interested in as well. Next slide. And some questions there are also, because you have this concentration of cats and then you're sterilizing many of them and changing the behavior, you're having these cat-cat interactions that are happening in a way that you would never have before, as well as cat interactions with other things like raccoons or opossums that are also feeding at these same locations. And so the question is how these new interactions and new social organizations affect cat evolution as well. Next slide.
All right, and this is just a few final questions since we're at 1 o'clock, and we really do want to hear some feedback if anyone's got anything. But just some broader speculations on this that I think really do, we keep asking ourselves about this project. In some ways, the first question seems kind of odd. Is the Anthropocene too anthropocentric? But one of the things we're actually, I think, trying to ask here is it possible that cats and other collaborators actually share some of the blame or responsibility for this thing we call the Anthropocene, rather than continuing to insist on the human capacity or the human control over everything, as well as the human cause or responsibility or blameworthiness for everything. Maybe there's actually a way to rethink in a kind of multi-species ethnographic sense or ethnoprimatological sense what the nature of this collaboration has been over the course of human history, as well as what it could be in the future. And do we need to rethink our concern with what makes us human as a story of these collaborations or niche expansions over time? And especially to ask to who are the we or us in the story. A lot of the critiques of the Anthropocene have been focused on the kind of displacement of work that does away from acts of colonization or of aggression or imperialism. And in the case of the LA TNR controversy, then I guess, one way to put this very baldly is that, at least in this case, LA has chosen cats over birds. And the question there is this an evidence of some sort of failure of human control or politics, or is it also something which is a story of cat success or cat-human success? And a lot of the work in multi-species ethnography is asking questions about how do we bring animals more into the political realm? How do we actually give them a voice or whatnot? And I think this complicates that a little bit by suggesting that cats are already there along with us. And it's really a question of sort of saying, well, what kind of political entity is that when we recognize that we implicitly have a relationship with certain animals that's different than the relationship that we have with other relationships? And then one final question there, which is just thinking about many of the answers to this problem especially in the TRR controversy, are to push responsible pet ownership, take care of your cat, keep your cat indoors, spay or neuter your cat, etc. But that may be actually, in a kind of weird way, a kind of mismatch with our collaborative or evolutionary heritage along with cats. For well over a couple of millennia, we've been really actively working to do something different with cats, and cats have been, as from the cat perspective, taking advantage of the niches we've been providing for them. And so to call on human responsibility at this point may be a misunderstanding of where we've gotten to. Okay, so those are just some questions for discussion. Thank you to everyone, including the people who've provided the funding for this research, and all of our wonderful HBS undergrads who did a bunch of work with us, research with us, and grad students as well. And you can see them all listed here. So thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Jessica, for that talk. A lot to think about here. And as you said, we're not here to pick any fights. So you know,
especially not dog versus cat fights. It's not going to happen here.
Yeah, we're not here to fight those battles at all. If anyone would care to raise their hand, please, into chat if you'd like to comment on any of the points raised in this talk. We'd appreciate it. And I should note my internet is being flaky, so if I disappear, it's a technological glitch, but I think it's been stable for the last few minutes. So I'll let Chris and Jessica just field questions. There's a couple of hands risen already.
Got it. All right,
Katrina.
Thank you. So thank you for this really, really interesting talk. There's so many interesting things to think about. I'm really fascinated. So I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll just maybe like give you like one sort of question or thing I was thinking about. So cats are interesting that they probably like the only pet that really kept this independence in comparison to other pets. And they also seem to be territorial, at least from sort of like cats I watch in my neighborhood. A lot of cats really, protect their yard. They also have this access to food supply from humans, and and then there's still this interesting thing that they go out and seem to compete with wild cat counterparts. And there was this idea that Jessica talked about stockpiling, which makes sense, but there's still this question for me, like when animal has all access to these resources, and even humans will solve their territorial problems sometimes, if neighbor cats are fighting, humans will do something about it. Why they still are going into the wild and putting themselves into danger? Are they attracted to danger somehow? Or, there's some like something special about some cats? So it's very open. Thank you.
I mean, I think one thing, just getting at that question also has to do with individual variation across cats. So one thing that many of our interviewees talked about was how they had some cats that were perfectly happy to stay indoors and just live that lifestyle and didn't yearn for the outside, whereas other ones were trying to get out all the time. And humans modify their ownership, like their behavior as owners, often based on their perceived, their perception of what the animals themselves need. So I think part of the answer is, again, there's this wide variation in cat behavior. I
just add the variation is also within the same cat. We have people talking about cats that are born, wild, they are tamed, and then they return to being feral, right? And so there's this, even within the individual lifespan, this story of variation in what a cat can be. So.
But I am interested in those dynamics, and in terms of, if we really were trying to model what's going up and down in cat populations in terms of personality, behavior, or these variations, if you are a docile cat and stay inside, you may lack the reproductive opportunities, right? And so you may not be passing on that docility to further generations. And often what I also have found is that most of the abandonment of cats is because of these like nuisance behaviors, the spraying, yowling, scratching stuff, like normal cat behaviors, but some do it more than others. And then those ones are often released from captivity, abandoned, and then they have more reproductive opportunity. And so, yeah, I think it would be interesting to think about what might happen in cat populations over time. Dan?
Thanks, Jessica and Chris. Really, really interesting and an incredible breadth of ideas that you've brought in. Among all the things one could talk about, I want to focus on the evolutionary dynamics in particular. And I mean, there are clear parallels between the THVR strategy and, like, mosquito control with sterile males and this kind of thing. But it strikes me that given the life history of cats, where I think it typically a cat can live over a decade, right? But they reach sexual maturity in something like 6 months, right? So there's maybe another dimension to the TNR approach, which is that there's selection for faster life history, right? So if body size doesn't matter that much because you're in a population of largely docile, sterile individuals, then you can afford to mature earlier at the expense of body size. And if the roving neutralizers are always out there, that's from a selection perspective, that's the equivalent of high extrinsic mortality, right? Because you're removed from the breeding population once you're sterilized. So it would be really interesting to know whether in locations where there have been, for a decade or more, systematic programs of TNR, whether what you're seeing is, a faster life history, that the animals are maturing earlier and reproducing sooner, and conceivably having smaller body size. And the THVR strategy produces that a little bit, but it doesn't completely stop it, right? It just means that the selective disadvantage of smaller body size is higher, but it's still, the basic, extrinsic mortality component is still there. So both strategies conceivably could be leading to selection for faster life history. And if the populations are large enough, that should be measurable, right?
And I think what's interesting is that there's both evidence for, like, in general, if you compare wild cats to domestic cats, there already is a selection toward faster life history in terms of reproducing earlier, having bigger litter sizes in general, and then having more litters per year. So all of those things kind of go on that. But then the thing that's interesting also is that the subsidized or indoor lifestyle also pushes life history to, they can live for 15 years instead of 5 years, which is the average outdoor. So there can be things like going in different directions in terms of life history. So
yeah, I mean, it seems like there should be, I don't know whether there's evidence from rodent control efforts in places like New York City, where there's essentially an inexhaustible food supply, right? And if you have high kill rates in rodent control, all you're doing is selecting for faster life history. But there might be direct parallels with other urban mammal populations that have already been studied.
Yeah, I think just on that latter point, there is some evidence of that with rodents for sure, and that's a really interesting comparison case there, I think. But there's another aspect to it. It's not exactly what you're asking, but with either THVR or TNR, you're also producing cats with a very long lifespan, but with no reproductive activity. And they're not just sitting around doing nothing, right? They are engaged in social behaviors within colonies or other cats in the neighborhood or other kin. And there's some interesting questions there, I think, about what cats do with their post-reproductive lives that they wouldn't necessarily be doing if they hadn't been spayed or neutered, right? And so I think that's another direction from that point.
Yeah, really interesting.
Maddie?
Hi, I'm a grad student in EEB, and I'm studying how introduced carnivores like cats and dogs impact native carnivores. And I thought your talk was so interesting and you covered so much ground. So thank you for that. I was curious when you brought up this idea of the human facilitated niche expansion. I was also thinking about how cats and local carnivores can transmit diseases across species. I was thinking about how cats die from rat poisoning and get hit by cars. And I was wondering how these sort of like negative novel changes in the cat's environment, since they didn't obviously evolve with cars and rat poison, how these negative things are affecting the way we see cats' benefits from domestication.
Hmm.
Do you mean cats, how cats benefit from domestication, or the benefits humans have from cats domestication?
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about how, when we think about the evolution of how, cats kind of self-domesticated, if you will, and about how that was kind of a commensalism. And nowadays in a city like LA, when there are so many threats to cats that are outdoors, perhaps that's not entirely balanced, right? Like perhaps they're not seeing as many benefits as there are like these new introduced costs to that relationship.
I mean, I think one of the things that has been really interesting in terms of the interviews around TNR, right? Because the no-kill initiative is saying that we don't want to kill animals in shelters. We want to get to the, we're at the 90% no-kill rate, but we want to like have no animals killed in shelters if possible. But the only way to have that happen is that you're willing to put cats back on the street. So that means trap, neuter, return, instead of having them there in the shelter where there's no room and you would have to euthanize because there's not enough people that want them. You have to put them back on the street. And so there's real differences in terms of the moral position that people take of what it means for putting a cat on the street. And some people or some organizations like PETA, for example, they think putting them back on the street is too much suffering, just what you're saying, like being hit by cars, being eaten by coyotes, like all these other things that can be ways that cats suffer and die, and that it's better just to euthanize them, right? Versus others who argue, like with the no-kill movement, they argue that having the cat's life extended in any way possible and not having human action being the cause of killing them is more important than the suffering that the cats themselves face. And so it's better just to leave them out and let them live their lives.
And just to put maybe a finer point on this, it's quite possible that the cats are as successful in a reproductive or in terms of lifespan, but have what we perceive to be a life of suffering, right? And that's what's at stake in this philosophical dispute between do you fight against the death of cats or do you fight against the suffering of cats, right? And that's what this is about in a political sense between something like PETA and the no-kill movement. But both sets of cats may very well be doing just fine by some more objective measure of their reproductive or lifespan, reproductive sex or lifespan.
And again, I think like that idea of the population level, like thinking about cats on a population level versus thinking about individual cats and individual cat welfare is a difference in terms of how like environmentalists are thinking about it versus no-kill people are thinking about how you should think about cats.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I definitely see that thinking about it at a population level is something that like an ecologist, might go for versus the sort of individualist perspective. Is obviously quite different. So thank you both for that.
Sasha?
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was wondering, well, first of all, I want to know what are pink cats? And then I also was just thinking about like whether whether there's features that are shared between cats and other urbanized species like coyotes or raccoons, or like maybe similar animals that live in cities that we tend to think of, in different ways. But are any of those animals like trying to move into a cat niche, or could cats have started like, as sort of these flexible animals that are able to move into human spaces? Is that like one way that cats could have started their process of domestication? Like, are they just simply further along than a coyote or raccoon, or is there something different about them? Yeah, just wondering what you think about that.
I think that's one of the kinds of questions that we're really interested in trying to answer here. I don't use Instagram for much, but as a result of this project, I have a lot of raccoons and possums and feral cats and other kinds of urban animals in my feed. And I can say that the raccoons are being treated by a lot of people very much like cats. And so one has to wonder whether or not the raccoons are recognizing that there's a new available niche for them to move into there. And I think that's kind of, it's a little bit speculative, but I do think that, there's a class of animals in our cities that generally are maybe able to access that. And maybe Jessica can embellish on that. And then I can explain what pink cats means if you want.
I don't know. One thing that I was just thinking about in terms of comparing raccoons to another species, monkeys, capuchin monkeys. In Manuel Antonio in Costa Rica, there's this beach where people aren't supposed to feed the animals, but they historically have. And so there you can see now, the last time I went there, you could see both the monkeys coming down to grab food, but also raccoons making the rounds to get food. But it was very interesting, like the monkeys, they look you in the eye, they're seeing what you're gonna do, they, jump around, and they may be pretty active in securing the food themselves. But the raccoons, at least these raccoons, the raccoon species in Costa Rica, they never looked at the humans. They just sniffed around to find the foods. They never had any interest whatsoever in the humans. They just still knew that it was a place that food was available and they could get it, but their interaction with humans was absolutely and completely different. So I don't know about the people having raccoons as pets, how much they are able to like get that reaction from the raccoons. And I don't know also like if early cats or wild cats, I think that's part of that whole domestication process, but yeah.
And just very quickly, the pink cats is, so in Los Angeles, there was a lawsuit brought by the Urban Wildlands Group against the Animal Services Department of the LA City. And one of the outcomes was that until they did a proper environmental impact review of a TNR project, they weren't allowed to give out any information or vouchers or pay for anything related to TNR. And so all these volunteer groups and nonprofit organizations like Alley Cat Allies or Fixed Nation started referring to feral cats as pink cats almost as a code word, because they knew that they weren't supposed to be talking about it under this condition. And it's just one of those sort of ethnographic moments where you're like, oh, wow, we just invented this new kind of cat that's fully politically, like a result of the political climate around cats. And so that's what pink cats are there.
Abby?
Hi, thank you. Jessica, it's fun to hear about your cat research outside of your primate research for a change. So I was thinking about something you said early on in your talk about plasticity of cats and the way that they and combining it with sort of my own experiences with feral cats and trying to like get them into homes by taking them into my home. And I've noticed that there definitely is this window, right, where there's sort of a point of no return where the cat is, I want to say too old, but I'm using that in a really kind of generic way to kind of become part of that domestic space. And then, so I guess I wanted to hear if you guys were, and I'm thinking about sort of that, and then rooting that back to sort of some of the things I've thought about with epigenetic programming early in life. And so just sort of thinking about perhaps how, and maybe this feeds into sort of the domestication concepts of domestication for cats in particular, but like, do you think that there's sort of this window of domesticability in the cat's lifespan from what we know about cats now? And if you have any kind of ideas for sort of pursuing like epigenomic sorts of plasticity studies among current cats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something, again, with the interviews because with the TNR, people are, you know, on the one hand, they're returning these adult cats back to the locations because they're not adoptable, but they're also like watching in the city for new litters of kittens and trying to get them in to shelters as quickly as possible so they will be adoptable, right? Feral cats have kittens, and then you are trying to get them in that window so that they could be socialized and adopted and then go into the indoor like arena of things. And so it definitely is both this developmental window, and then also people talked about that idea of individual variation and personality. And some cats you can get later and can figure out how to get them domesticate or like, you know, tame, and others just never, they're completely resistant to it. So there might be both like individual variation in general, but then also this discrete window of time in early development. And I do think that question would be really interesting as an epigenetics question as well. And I think it's interesting also, like I was saying, the genome is basically the same between the wild cats and cats, but yet they, even though they're interacting on the landscape across this huge area, they're not like just becoming interchangeable. So something has to be like limiting that and stopping that from the wild cats just like becoming domestic cats too, right? And part of that story might be this social learning and epigenetic story.
And it would be interesting to tease apart the social learning question with cat mothers and kittens and humans and kittens. And, you know, because there's obviously two forms of interaction in that window that are possible, but both of them might be happening. And I think it's really interesting to think about what are the common elements across those, right? What forms of trust develop in that window that make a difference to a cat. So,
Deborah?
Yes, hi. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. So something I was thinking about is a little bit on the lines of what Daniel asked, and maybe you addressed this, I don't know, but do you think that the TNR is inadvertently leading to some sort of referalization? Because you were talking about the skew that the untrapped have much more reproductive success. So, I mean, I've tried to trap feral cats myself. It can be hell. So, and it's fairly obvious to me, it was fairly obvious to me that the ones that didn't get trapped were the really, who are the ones that were less commensal, less docile, more feral, more resistant to human contact. And those are sort of hallmarks of domestication, is all this sort of tameability, docility, relationship to humans. Are you skewing, or are we through TNR skewing toward reproductive success among less docile and more feral cats?
I mean, I think so, absolutely. It's not something that I've done any formal modeling about, but just the intuition is that is the direction, at least for that part of the story. And of course, because cat populations are widespread and there are a lot of different interactions and all this different space we were talking about in terms of, you know, what cats are doing across their lifetime, at least in the specific case of urban feral cat colonies and TNR efforts, it definitely is sterilizing those that are willing to be trapped, you know, are willing to go into cages to get food, and giving increased reproductive success to those that are staying out of traps. So I mean, part of it's complicated by that idea of that developmental period and the developmental window to become domestic. And so one question is, are these super untamed, feral, avoidant cats, are they really any different than other cats? Or, is it just their development that's different? Or is there something genomically different about them that's conferring them those attributes that is being selected for?
And in a city, it's really hard to figure out because, as we were showing with that diagram, you just have this endless population of cats, including owned cats that are fully, tamed and live in houses, but that their owners may not have spayed or neutered, who then, get out or roam or maybe meet one of these cats, right? And there's just a kind of endless circulation of these cats in the city because of the density of different kinds of individuals and different populations. So it's not that it wouldn't be, a fascinating thing to try and study, but it's got a lot of complexity to it for sure.
Katrina?
Thank you. I wanted also to ask, when you were talking about the success of cat and human relationship, have you thought about also bringing another organism like a parasite? I always thought that's so interesting about cats and toxoplasmosis, right? They specialize in cats, and there's some evidence that it might affect human behavior, but I don't know how prevalent it is. Maybe, it's not sort of like, maybe it doesn't add much to general human cat story. Maybe it's just like these specific instances. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
I mean, I think that toxoplasmosis is a worldwide, pretty high level phenomenon. I think there is some disagreement about some aspects of the story, such as how much it's influencing human behavior and humans preference for cats. But I do think in general, thinking about the different disease organisms and how that's circulating. One idea is with the plague, if cats were a positive effect, people who had cats may have survived better because of mousing and keeping rodents away from their houses, right? And so that would be another human cat collaboration. So there's both the diseases that cats themselves carry and can pass, and ways that cats might decrease disease for humans.
There's at least one article out there that asks the question of whether or not toxoplasmosis in humans leads to greater risk taking on the basis of for those who have it versus those who don't. So, What's up?
Hi, I'm a grad student in physiology. I work with domestic songbirds, populational genomics of domestic songbirds. I have a question, as I should know, but I'm gonna ask you. There is this idea that domestication can lead to outrociality. Some events of domestication can lead to animals be born more immature and actually slower life history in that way, that they will mature more slowly, their learning sensitive period will elongate. Does this happen to, in dogs? It seems like it's what happened. Does this in some songbirds, like the one that I studied, the Bengalese finch? Did this happen during the cat domestication too? Are cats more tricial? Do they have elongate? Do we know that? Thank you.
I would say in general that's not happening in the same way as it is in those species that you were talking about. In cats, they do have, like I was saying, they have a little bit of a shift towards earlier reproduction. And then you can also have, part of it that's a little difficult to disentangle is all the subsidy from human feeding, care, and all of that, and how that would affect the life history trajectory if you're studying cats that are cared for versus wild cats that are just living in the wild, right? But it would be nice to do a study of completely feral cats versus wild cats to see what those parents, especially when we're talking about those places where the wild cats live that have domestic cats wild on the landscape as well, to compare like what those life histories are and if there is some shift with the domestic cats.
I thought I'd ask a question about the selection pressures that are at work when people go to county, cat shelters or dog shelters like I've done in LA. And it's almost like a selection experiment. You walk into a room that has 50 cages with cats in it, and you go one by one and choose the one that you're interested in taking home. And if the fate of those that aren't selected by a potential cat adopter is being spayed or neutered, or in some cases being euthanized, is there any work that you're doing looking at that part of the selection process to see? I mean, I remember myself anecdotally, the cat that approached the cage, just like in Baileyev's foxes, that's the one that I took home. But you can also think about that process on the entire system of bringing cats into one location, making it really easy for people to adopt them. That could have its own intensifying effect on selection as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think like the question of humans' choice and how humans are prioritizing cats and which ones they're choosing is really interesting. And that question of how the morphological diversity, like how that would continue over time if like each individual is choosing a different kind, or people are trying to amass different varieties in their group of like their collection of cats. But also I think like most shelters, they requesting or making you spay or neuter when you select the cat. And so like both the process of catching feral cats and bringing them in to the shelter, and then the process of making them be spayed and neutered when you pick them, it's actually taking all of those cats that humans prefer out of the system. It's the cats that don't get caught in that trap that are the ones that can flourish, at least in the feral and the reproductive sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, okay, we've reached the time where we normally sign off on our Beck Talks. And again, thank you for putting together this talk for us. And it's been great to see people from further afield of the typical hardcore, EEB and anthropological sciences folks in here. So it's great to see so many fresh faces and to have this nice conversation. So really appreciate your time, Chris and Jessica. And we really look forward to seeing the paper that you'll craft from this. And as someone who works a little bit in the interdisciplinary space, I can understand how these papers take a lot of time to craft and think through. And I hope we provided some good points of discussion for you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for all your questions and help. It's been wonderful.